So sight reading involves many things at once, but the core skill, I guess the clue is in the name, sight and reading. And you first have to be able to read what's on the score and process it in order to be able to play it. Now, one of the most challenging things with sight reading for most pianists is that there's often so much information to gather and interpret in the score, and you have to do this while you're playing. And so it stands to reason that how one uses one's eyes and knowing where to look is a really essential part of being able to sight read effectively. So the advanced sight reading curriculum's first part is dedicated purely to eye training. Now, given that there's a limited amount of time to look at the score while playing, it stands to reason that one should be spending as much time as possible keeping one's eyes on the score. So the first module is called Keeping Your Eyes on the Score. And this is actually really difficult to do because I think, I speak for many of us when I say that we're very used to looking at our hands and feeling a greater sense of comfort, particularly when it comes to things like leaps, by looking at the keyboard. But what this does is it effectively further reduces the time that you have to be looking at the score. So this module looks at ways of trying to look at the score as much as possible and look at one's hands only when one absolutely has to. And what it does is it gives a few really interesting, quite clever ways that are alternatives to looking at your hands. And there's a few recommendations, like just practicing in the dark or not looking at your hands or covering the keyboard in some way can be a really good way just to get a better sense of confidence and feeling for the keyboard geography. There are also suggestions that instead of looking straight at your hands, you can also you just use your peripheral vision to sometimes just get a feel of where you need to go. And then there's a whole lot of really clever ideas for how to measure distances, because that's, I guess, one of the most challenging parts in keeping your eyes on the score is when you have to jump all over the place. How do you avoid hitting a wrong note without looking at your hands? So it starts with the diagnostic test, which is really interesting. And so I'm going to give this a try and show you how this works and show you what some of my takeouts from it were. So the diagnostic test, basically it's a set of notes that are a bit all over the place really. And what you do is you start with your hands on your lap, you play each note without looking at the keyboard, and you return your hands to your lap in between each measure. So I'll start with this, and so basically, okay, there we go. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to make you sit through all of this. But what was interesting for me in doing that is that firstly, it's incredible how aware you become of that habit just to look down. I feel incredibly insecure not being able to look at my hands. I mean, I can, but there's a strong temptation there, and I'm trying really hard not to. The other thing is that I actually did better than I thought I would. So what's interesting about that is it tells us that perhaps part of the problem is not just the habit, but is confidence. And yes, I mean, obviously one will get it wrong, and each time I've tried this, I've made all sorts of messes. That's a whole other topic in itself, in that in sight reading we have to be more flexible and willing to accept wrong notes. But it's probably better to hit a wrong note and to keep going than to keep on trying to look down at the score and stop correcting yourself. I mean, that's just going to make for a very jilted performance. So I think, yes, there's basically two parts, or basically the main thing that strikes me is that I'm actually looking at the keyboard when I don't really need to. The other thing that's quite interesting is there's a fairly simple, and this works better, I think. I think you could use this in various places, but it works particularly well when the notes are close together. But basically, Ken's suggestion here is to use the black keys to orientate yourself and to figure out where a note is. So for example, in the left hand, I know there's a set of 2 there, so I know that there I'm going to get the D flat. And now just there. and that actually works quite well. And although you don't necessarily always have time in a performance to do that, you start to get a feel for where things are. And I guess it's probably, I feel very blessed, as I suppose most people are, who are able to see. But if you were blind, I mean, I can't imagine what it must be like to be blind. But when you see blind people moving around, it's often incredible how they develop an alternative sense or spatial sense without sight. And I guess that's what we're actually trying to do here. So I think, yeah, that it's a useful and interesting test, and but what it really does is underlines some of the key problems, which is effectively what the next set of modules go on to address. So it's relatively straightforward to develop a sense of keyboard geography and to find out where to know where notes are when they are closer together. I guess it's just a case of getting out of the habit of looking at your hands when you don't have to. As I said earlier, I'm amazed at how often I do that when it's just instinct, but when it's really not all that necessary. But where things get really difficult is when you have jumps and bigger distances. That can be hard enough for a piece that you've learned, but it's certainly really challenging with sight reading when you're trying to keep your eyes on the score and not look at those distances. And with sight reading, other than a few very commonly found intervals, like say things like an octave or whatever, you don't have time to learn the distances. So you've got to find another way of figuring out how to find those notes with minimizing the amount of time you're looking at your hands. So the first way that, the first concept that Ken introduces is the idea of trying to find closest notes. Instead of looking at the extremes in a leap, particularly when there's chords and a left-hand accompaniment, as we'll see in an example now, you try and find the closest notes together, and that makes the distances less daunting. I think what it really does is it gives you some kind of a frame of reference to then orientate yourself around. So the first example is fairly straightforward, but it's quite a good way to introduce the concept. It's a Schubert German dance, I think it's a Ländler. And so what it does is basically, what the instruction here says is that you should use the C that's in the middle of the left-hand accompaniment as a point of reference to orientate yourself around. It's much easier than using the lower C and the upper G, because I mean, that's a 13th apart, so it's quite an awkward interval to measure. But whereas if you do it like this, you've got some kind of security or a frame of reference. And I just played through this once quickly in preparation for this, and I was surprised by how much more secure I felt just thinking that way. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play through this again. So this is effectively my second reading, and I'm not going to apologize for the fact that it's probably going to be abysmal to listen to, because if I had practiced this up, it would be really inauthentic, and that's not what sight reading is about. I think, as a consolation, if you find it awful to listen to what I'm playing, at least hopefully it might be encouraging in some way just to know that other people struggle with sight reading too. As I mentioned in my introduction videos, I'm a terrible sight reader. Okay, well, so with that, one of the things I must just point out, I didn't play the repeats because I feel most of you probably haven't been bad enough people in your lives to deserve listening to that again. But Ken suggests always using the repeat as it's effectively a free second chance. So that's definitely something worth doing. The other thing that was quite interesting is you may have seen, I don't know if you could see my eye movements on the video, but I did still look at my hands. It's almost impossible not to sometimes, but not as much as I thought I would need to. The other thing that is quite interesting is that when I was looking at my hands, I guess because I'm trying to be more aware of this now, and it doesn't come easily, but I guess this is trying to form a new habit. When I did look, particularly when there is no note as a reference, when particularly the second part, the B part, where things get more spread out in the left hand, I realized that I could just quickly glance with my peripheral vision rather than lingering on the keyboard. And so that's definitely something that I guess is developed further as we go throughout this module. But this is definitely a very interesting introduction and well worth trying. And the other thing is even if some of the material here, I will be talking a bit more about how you could use this curriculum if you're at an intermediate level. This is relatively accessible. You could also slow it down. I probably could have played it a bit slower and made things a bit easier for myself. But also you could look out for pieces, any waltzes or dances and things like that, that have that kind of left-hand accompaniment with leaps. Is quite a good way to practice this, and look out for a note that's shared or the closest point between chords.